So we will get started by welcoming everybody here this afternoon, and delighted that you can be here with us at this culmination of Midsummer Festival, which is today, I believe. And this is the second of our events. We started with a Pride Shabbat last Saturday, and so we're welcome to our panel, which is called Jewish, Queer and Proud, bringing Jewish values into queer communities and queer values into Jewish communities. And we're going to be hearing from our guests shortly on a whole variety of related issues, I expect, including a trip to Argentina that they've all returned from. And also, and perhaps most importantly, they will respond to questions from anybody. And you might have written some questions down on the way in. You might feel more comfortable writing them down, or you're very welcome to ask them directly when we get to that. I just want to put, first of all, acknowledgement of the indigenous people of the land, the Wurundjeri people, who's the custodians of the land that we gather on today, and to pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to say that this is my weekend off, but I'm here because this coincides with the end of the Midsummer Festival, and it's really important for me and our community that we have these opportunities of raising awareness and hearing and getting the opportunity to explore issues around pride, and frankly to be proud of the diversity in our community, and hopefully our openness, and hopefully helping to develop more understanding and openness amongst the community. Some of us know that we've had challenges and it's been difficult from time to time at Baeck and in other places. Now, one of the reasons I'm having a weekend off this weekend is because I deserve it. Wonderful. And I should say, in case some of you don't know, I'm Rabbi Jonathan Baeck, and I'm very lucky that I'm the rabbi of this community and have been here since 2003, and this is a wonderful place to be. Sometimes challenging, but basically wonderful. But one of the reasons I'm off this weekend is because we have cousins here from Britain. And yesterday, it doesn't sound like a weekend off, but yesterday I was in Kyneton with them, leading a special service, and Sue was with me too, and Jerry and Elsa were there as well, we have a little Chavara group in Kyneton, it's called the Goldfields, and it's in Kyneton or Castlemaine or in that vicinity, Bendigo, and they have an annual service, Shabbat service, which is an interfaith service, and it coincides approximately with Tu B'Shvat, which is New Year for trees, and that's actually this evening. So happy Tu B'Shvat to everybody. And we've expanded Tu B'Shvat to be more an awareness of the environment and our responsibility, our relationship with the environment. And so we started yesterday with a prayer acknowledging the people who were killed or injured or have lost their homes, and all the animals who have been affected by the terrible fires, for which there is still smoke haze all over where we were driving out yesterday. But the reason I mention this is more to tell you that I didn't really realise. I knew my cousin Ruth, who is here, who we were took with us, grew up in the liberal movement, in the liberal Jewish movement, but I hadn't realised until she arrived that she is about, and neither had she for that matter, that she's about to become the chair of liberal Judaism in Britain. And that's because she was persuaded to be vice chair, and the chair has just resigned. So on her way here, she got on the plane, she wasn't, and now she is. So, and the reason I mention this is because we were talking about pride and GLBTIQ understanding issues, and of course the liberal movement in Britain has been pushing the way, and I was involved when I was part of the liberal movement as a rabbi there before I came here. So in 2000, 2001, we already introduced same-sex commitment ceremonies. And some of the wording that we use actually is derived from what they developed with Rabbi Mark Solomons, who's a member of the rabbinate there in the liberal movement, but comes originally from Sydney, some of you may know. And what she said to me surprised me. She said, "Oh, we wouldn't do a panel like this." So I've just left them in St Kilda and said, you know, they're going off on the ferry to Tasmania. They brought their tandem with them and they're cycling around Tasmania and the Great Ocean Road and up to Sydney and God knows what. But they're enthusiastic. But so basically she said, oh, in the Liberal movement we wouldn't have a panel like this because everybody just knows that we must accept everybody. Now, I have my doubts about that. I'm surprised to hear that because I would have expected the Liberal movement still to be promoting and talking about and raising awareness and not just, oh, we're okay. So I'm interested in that. But I also was interested to hear that their 2 youth workers in the Liberal movement have both transitioned sex or gender since they started working in the movement, which is remarkable. I mean, given the number of people that could have been doing the job, that both of them went through that process. So I suppose in a sense that probably says something about their openness to the space to feel comfortable enough to do that and to be supported and to, you know. So maybe she's right. Anyway, that's by the way. I just one short more bit to say, if you haven't had one of the Celebrating Diversity bracelets, which we were giving out on the Pride Shabbat, please take one. Well, there's 5 left, that's what I'm saying. There's only 5 left. So, because they went quickly last week on the service. You've all got one?
I don't know.
So if anybody wants one. And to say that it says in Hebrew, B'Tselem Elohim, and it has the UPJ's menorah symbol. B'Tselem Elohim means created in the image of God. So it's an acknowledgement that we are all part of God's diversity and every person has a spark of God in them. So having said all that, I would like to again welcome our panel, Nevo and Jarod and Ros. And Nevo is no stranger to us because Nevo spoke last year, or maybe the year before, and a fascinating talk about Nevo's journey, and is now going to introduce our panel. And thank you very much. Please warmly welcome them.
Thank you, everyone. So I'm Nevo Zisin. I'm an author and a public speaker in regards to trans and gender diversity. I go into schools and workplaces and educate on 101 definitions and ways to not be a jerk. This will not be that. This will be a little bit deeper than that, hopefully. I think that marginalised people get pretty tired of speaking about the 101s for tens of years. So we're hoping to delve a little bit deeper than that today, which may mean that there are things that you might not understand or might not fully conceptualize, and I use that as an invitation to look into some of these topics a little bit deeper and have these discussions with us as well. I would also really like to acknowledge the true custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people and Bunurong of the Kulin Nations, and by extension also say that I think acknowledgements are important, but I also think that they're done by the very same government who then goes in and bulldozes sacred land. So acknowledgements don't really mean anything if they're not followed up with action. And there are a lot of initiatives out there about paying the rent to the true custodians, that if you do pay rent on the house that you live in, or if you own the house that you live in, maybe considering whose land that actually is, and talking about how you might be able to financially compensate the true custodians, I think is really important. So we're going to do a little bit of an intro of ourselves. I was going to read a poem, but I think I might leave that one till the end if we have time, because I have many questions, which we will not get around to. So I've done my introduction. Did you want to give yourself next?
Hi everyone, I'm Ros. I'm actually Jess's sister that you might know from LBC. I'm a writer as well. I tend to write a lot about identity, often queerness and gender identity, sometimes about Judaism as well, and a lot of other political issues, including education. I'm also, so I wear a few different hats. I'm also a high school teacher, a PhD candidate, an editor at Archer magazine, and I'm probably forgetting a few other things that I do, but it's a busy but exciting life. And yeah, I'm also used to talking about these topics a lot. I like Nevo's acknowledgement that it can get tiring to kind of go through the same information, particularly when it's our identity and it's something that's just what we live 24/7, to explain to people sometimes in environments who not just don't understand, and I don't think that's the case for this group here at all, but where there's often a lot of either judgment or just yeah, different things that come up a lot, and we'll talk about that more in relation to the Jewish community, but I personally am excited to talk to a group of people who are really interested in this topic and who've given up a Sunday to be here, and yeah, looking forward to it.
Hi everyone, my name's Jarod. As Roz has just said, thank you so much for giving up some of your Sunday to be with us today. So I work in disability employment support. So I spend every day helping people to talk through some issues in their life. So I'm very used to having important conversations. It's only been recently where I've started to have those conversations about my own sexuality. But having been to Argentina, having spoken at Pride Shabbat last week at TBI, and a few other things, I feel, and with private conversations I've had with Orthodox Jews who are struggling with their sexuality, I think I've been in the position to open up the conversation and to help progress things. And I'm grateful to be here tonight, this afternoon with you all.
Right, I think we should also do our pronouns. I realised that we forgot to do that. So I use they, them pronouns, which can be used as a singular. If you've never heard them used as a singular, I have a lot of references of historical texts which will explain that they, them has been used as a singular longer than you has been used as a singular. So we can talk about that. I'm writing a book about it at the moment. Did you want to?
Yeah, I use they, them pronouns. I also kind of use she, her pronouns, partly because I'm in that transition-y sort of stage with it. So also happy to speak to some of that because I find that there's various levels of understanding and acceptance of pronouns. This is a topic in the different spaces that I'm part of, and so I think that's an important thing to engage in.
I'm he, him pronouns.
I'll also mention that you may have seen on the event page or as you came in that we're taking donations today. We're all here on a voluntary basis, but the donations that we're collecting are for a school in Argentina that we visited on a recent trip called Nocheselis, which is a trans-run school. So it's a school run entirely by trans people, initially for trans people, and then classic trans people expanded out to anyone who was disenfranchised and needed the space. They receive no funding whatsoever. The government pays the wages of the teachers, but everything else comes out of their pockets. So stationery, renovations, anything like that is from them, and they're in a particularly low socioeconomic area in Buenos Aires. If you know anything about Argentina's socioeconomic kind of situation, it's a mess and kind of a constant crisis. So that's where the money will be going to. All right, let's dive into it. I'm interested in the topic of this panel, which is, you know, bringing Jewish values into queer spaces and queer values into Jewish spaces. What are some Jewish values that you hold? Whether that is like a religious kind of framework or whether it's a cultural framework, what are those values for you?
Sure. Well, I've been through an interesting journey with Judaism. So my values have changed over time. Quick overview, when I was younger, I found it difficult to be Jewish. I also found it difficult to be gay. So there was a time where I repressed my gayness and dove into Judaism. There was a time I repressed my Judaism and my gayness at the same time. And then it took a long journey to rediscover both of those. What I've found over that journey is that the defining principle for Judaism has always been Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, loving your neighbor as yourself. And whether I choose to wrap my tefillin every morning, whether I, know the ins and outs of the Tanakh and Tanya and all of that stuff, whether I know where to stand and sit in shul, as long as I wake up every day thinking, what's one thing I can do to make the world a better place, that makes me feel more Jewish than anything else in the world.
Yeah, I think for me, so to give my little background context, I went to Maria College in Sydney, which is modern Orthodox, even though our family were very much progressive. So a bit of a disjuncture there between the different parts of Judaism. And I didn't really identify with Judaism until I got involved with Netzer as a teenager. And it was learning about Tikkun Olam, which was something that, not to kind of speak against Mariah, but it wasn't something that had come up too often in that environment. So I think, you know, for the first time, I had just become vegetarian and vegan at that time, and so, and really cared about environmental issues. And I think seeing that really represented in Judaism is what really spoke to me and made me feel a connection for the first time.
Cool, yeah, and for my context, I grew up in a really progressive Jewish family that was like, you know, my dad was quite anti anything religion or sort of Jewish related. It was my mum who kind of pushed me into those spaces. I went to Scopus, which was a big part of my trauma, and left Scopus, which was a big part of my liberation, and went to a non-Jewish school, and then graduated from King David, which was a very different experience. And I think for me, it's been a really big process of coming to Judaism from a cultural framework and understanding that there are so many different aspects of Judaism, you know, religion, language, culture, food, music, art, so many different things, and that you can actually take a lot of those things without some of the others, and that doesn't make you any less Jewish. That there are a lot of Jewish atheists, for example, and no one would tell them that they're not Jewish. Like, it's kind of a sign you're stuck forever, which I actually really value. So I think also being a part of a youth movement, I was a part of Harmonium for 13 years, and so was my mom, and so was my grandmother, and I think that had a really big impact on also being able to find spaces as a queer person. And for me, it was never, I don't think I ever considered that maybe I couldn't be Jewish or I couldn't be part of the Jewish community because I was queer. And I think that had a lot to do with growing up in Hobo and having that space. So those are some of our Jewish values. I also want to say that I think, especially when you're queer and Jewish, you get asked these questions sometimes of like, what does it mean to be queer and Jewish? It must be so hard or whatever. And it's like, my experience at least is that it's not necessarily like other religions or other religious spaces, in that, you know, the Jewish community is cultural and there are lots of expansive areas. And when people ask me what Jewish things I do or what Jewish values motivate me, there is no extracting my Jewishness from who I am. There is no compartmentalizing. This part is queer, this part, like this arm is queer, this arm is Jewish, this, you know, this eye, whatever. Like, there is no extracting myself from who I fundamentally am. So I believe every act that I do is fundamentally Jewish, is fundamentally trans, is fundamentally queer, because there just is no extraction. On that note, what are some queer values that you hold? What do queer values mean to you? What are things you've picked up from queer communities that you value?
I'm happy to field to start with. Well, this is a difficult question for me to answer because in many ways I find my experience with the queer community and the gay community specifically, I found it to be quite toxic and quite isolating in many ways because it is a community which is bound together by trauma and sexuality. And I think that building a community from those two things alone is limiting. That said, I think that one of the incredible things I've gained from the gay community and queer community, possibly even over the Jewish community, is the full embracing of being true to oneself and the individual over peer pressure, the individual over the herd, if you will. In many ways, the herd, the community that Judaism provides is safety, is tradition, is like a warm hug from an old friend. But then sometimes it can cause one to repress and to stretch and to contort bits of oneself. And within the gay community, I feel more at peace with being myself.
Yeah, for me, it's a tough one. We'll go back to the question about values in the queer community. I think for me, it's where I found a lot of liberation. So my journey really with queer community began in 2002, 2003. So things have changed a lot in that time. And when my wife, will nod to her in the front row, we've been together for a very long time. We came out together and we went through a lot of stuff. And in the queer community at the start, we did not really find home or our place in it. And we have come to, or I would come to now. But yeah, it was a journey. Whereas with Judaism, it was even more fraught than that. So, whereas with the queer community, it was more like, oh, okay, the things that are available involve a lot of socializing and a lot of clubbing and a lot of things that aren't necessarily what I'm into. Whereas with Judaism, I found more kind of acute rejection. And that's within orthodoxy, but even in progressive spaces to an extent. There was a lot of a lack of understanding, a lot of erasure of understanding the nuances in our relationships and gender identity. And I think one thing that I found in queerness has always been like a beautiful radical streak that I love and have always really related to. Whereas I found it much harder to find that in Judaism. And I've only really found it in Judaism through the queer lens, which, so there's a group that Nevo is co-founder, I don't even know if
Pure founder.
Pure founder, amazing. The Nevo runs that I know that for myself and for a lot of the people in it, often it's our only real queer Jewish community. A lot of us don't go into shuls for various reasons, may not go into clubs or other queer spaces for various reasons, and it's this wonderful safe space. A lot of us are close friends, even if it's mostly online, and I think the values that we share, even though there's definitely tensions, get into Israel-Palestine, get into a number of different topics, but I think there's something there that we find that's like a home and a comfort in each other. And yeah, there's this real kinship and crossover in the values in a way that I don't necessarily often articulate, but yeah, it's something really beautiful.
Just to add to that, at the end of last year, we had a Hanukkah event with Here Queer and Jewish, hosted by Nevo, and I just want to mention that experience was truly incredible for me, to have people who may not have found a reason to be with other queer people or other Jewish people, and to be in a very safe, inviting space that I could feel the combined joy, just utter joy at being in that moment. So thank you for facilitating that.
My pleasure. I think what's really clear from what you have both said, and that I think is important to articulate as well, is that there is no homogenizing of both Jewish community or queer community, that when we speak about Jewish community or queer community, we're all speaking about different communities. And I think that's really important to articulate as well, that also depending on your positionality and the ways that you're accessing spaces, your experiences of those spaces will be really different. So I think that there are really significant differences, for example, between gay communities or gay spaces and what we refer to as queer communities. If you're not familiar with those terminology, it might not seem clear what that difference is. People within those communities might be unclear about what that difference is. But for me, I think queerness is, firstly, it's a reclaimed slur, so a lot of people have discomfort with it, with that word, especially generationally. So older generations of LGBTIQA people may not feel comfortable with that term used for them, and I wouldn't project that onto people unless they self-identify. But it's a reclaimed slur in that when you reclaim a word, it takes the power out of it. So if someone would say, oh, what are you, a queer? I'd be like, yes, great observation. Good work, clearly. So it's a really powerful, autonomous reclamation.
Plus it's easier to say than LGBTIQ+.
That's also true. What I also like about it is that if people ask me what I am and I respond queer, they leave just as confused as when they got there, which is fine by me. So yeah, I feel like that's an important kind of disclaimer. And for me as well, queerness is it's an activist identity. It's queer not as a noun but as a verb. So to queer the status quo, to queer society, to be constantly questioning the norms. So for me, I think some of the values that I've taken from queer community is that verb, that action, that kind of ongoing challenging of each other that I feel maybe sometimes we could do with some more of in the comfort of our Jewish communities, that I'm not sure that we're always testing ourselves as far as we can go, and that I think that in some of the spaces I've occupied, at least in Jewish communities, there is a kind of complacency due to comfort. There's this text that I find really interesting that describes the Melbourne Jewish community a little bit as like the synagogue that I don't go to has to be Orthodox. Yeah. So it's this idea of like appearances, and like I remember my mum buying me bread on Pesach and like hiding it under her jumper because she was like, if anyone sees, like it'll be a disaster kind of thing. Or you know, lots of people who don't practice anything halachically but will not eat pork. And when you ask them about it, they can't tell you why. Things like that, you know, I have nothing against that, but there's just this lack of intentionality, I think, around that, which maybe in queer spaces, usually if you ask someone why they're doing something, they can tell you the exact theory behind it, or like this really well thought out kind of process. Again, like, people are welcome to disagree with me, this is just my take. So I think that kind of intentionality and demanding more of each other and pushing each other to be better activists, I like to bring into Jewish spaces. And I think the thing that queer spaces lack, that Jewish communities are very good at, is that Jewish communities show up. They really show up for you, even if you've grown up with people who are right-wing, who have completely different politics to you, who just have a different perspective on the world. If a family member passes away, they will be there with lasagna, they will bring you chicken soup when you're sick, they will show up. Even if you've come out and they don't get it and they don't want to talk about it ever, they'll still show up. Whereas I think in queer communities there is this kind of cannibalism that exists sometimes, of as soon as you don't conform to a certain doctrine of ideology, you're excommunicated. So it's this like, I feel like there's this perfect meeting spot that if we can bring these communities and some of their values together, we could have like utopia. So for me, I think those are the kind of the queer and Jewish values.
I would like to follow on from what you've just said, Nevo. So yesterday I went to Shabbat together at Mizrahi Shul, and the speaker gave a talk about disability inclusion within Judaism. And they essentially spoke about how there are people who may walk into Or David Shul, maybe they're a couple who are having trouble conceiving, maybe they're part of the LGBTI, what she said, LGBTI community, who may feel that they may be ostracized in that environment, and various other examples. And then she went on to speak about ways that we can work together to improve the inclusion of people with physical, mental, intellectual disability. And I think that's a really positive story for, obviously Judaism is incredibly diverse, and maybe different shuls side by side on the same street may have different responses. But I just wanted to share that really inspirational story.
I want to talk a little bit about representation, and I think that we've both kind of touched on some of the difficulties that exist in living in an intersection, right? So when two different kinds of identities meet, and how to hold them in their truth. So I'm interested in, growing up, what were some representations of yourself that you saw or didn't see? What did that feel like, and what was the importance in that? And have you got representation now that feels representative? Is the word I could come up with.
There's a representation of queer Jewishness.
Of you.
Of me.
Seeing yourself reflected in the media that you consume, or...
The only time I see myself reflected back is in the mirror. Well, I think that so last week I gave a speech at Temple Beth Israel, and the parsha I was given was in the middle of the Exodus from Egypt story. And I was thinking about what the relationship I've had with Judaism and the relationship I've had with my queerness over time. And the conclusion I came to is that often it seems like to be one, you have to reject the other. To be one, you have to repress the other. But I think that Judaism and queerness have a lot in common. We're actually quite similar in many ways. I think the fabric, I'll quote you my speech. The fabric of Judaism is woven with the thread of struggle, trauma, and pain. The queer community is much the same. We've both been through a lot, but our narratives are also ones of resilience, survival, and unity. And I genuinely believe that. I think that any time a queer person is struggling and they overcome, that's something that us as Jews can identify with. Whenever a Jew is remembering the traumas of our past, the Holocaust, the exodus from Egypt, the pogroms, modern day anti-Semitism, a queer person can look to that and say, I identify, I see myself in you. So I think there's a lot we can learn from each other and a lot we can teach each other too. And I'm actually really grateful to be both gay and Jewish because I have a unique ability to see that and to share that with other people.
I don't even know where to go on from there, but going back to representation, the only person that came to mind was Willow in Buffy, with Buffy people in the crowd, but yeah, with great. But as a queer, bisexual, sort of identified person, Jewish, Wiccan, yeah. Yeah, it was the first time there was a character like that I saw, and in terms of like continuing representation today, I mean things have changed. There's more nuance. There's a lot more shows. But I guess I come back to Buffy because it was at the time that I needed it, whereas now I just watch it for entertainment rather than seeking something like that, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember seeing any representations. I mean, I barely saw representations of queerness growing up. Jewish representations I never really connected with, and I certainly never saw any that embodied both of those. And then to put transness on top of that was like, absolutely not. So even though I may have been less in need of representation when it happened, I really do think that transparent coming out had a really big impact on me. Because it wasn't just one trans Jew, it was like an entire narrative around it, and it touches on intergenerational trauma and like the histories of our ancestry. And yeah, I think that was really quite big for me, especially because everyone was watching it. So everyone was kind of talking to me about this show, and people had political opinions about it as well. And I was a little bit like, I can actually tell you to stay in your lane about this one because this is queer Jewish transness. And last year for the the Festival of Jewish Art and Music, was able to be in conversation with Zachary Drucker, who is the producer of Transparent, and we spoke about transness and Judaism and what it means to exist in, as you said, like these kind of two marginalized identities in a world that is both increasingly progressive and increasingly hostile to both of those identities. And that was really, I feel like, touched on a lot of deep spots. And I think creating Here Queer and Jewish has also been that. But I think that when you exist in a marginalised identity, you create your own representation. You become your own role models and your own blueprints for what lives can look like, because no one has been able to model that for you. And I think especially something I think about often is, you know, there's this thing that like Jewish communities just cannot get past, which is like marrying out, as if it's just the most devastating thing to ever happen. And people talk about it, it's like, yeah, he's married, but he married out. And it's just like, so he's in love and married, that sounds really great. Now, yeah, I guess it is. When you're queer, like when I came out as a lesbian at 15, my mum said, okay, it's fine if you're a lesbian, but she has to be Jewish. And I was like, I know 3 Jewish lesbians, and they're all in their 40s. What do you want from me? And so sometimes we have this, like, it's an intentional queering, and sometimes there's just no other option. Like, you actually, your mere existence is a disruption. Your existence is a rebellion, even if you don't want it to be. You know, so some of us take the choice to take it much further, which I certainly have, but others we just can't help but be that elephant in the room that people don't want to speak about, you know, and it's this weird thing where, yeah, you have to become your own representation. I want to talk a bit about our trip to Argentina and what it was and why it was amazing. Does anyone want to give a bit of a summary about why did we go to Argentina? What was the deal? Why Argentina?
I'm happy to, yeah. So has anyone in the room heard about an organisation called JDC, the American
It used
Jewish
to go by
Joint?
Joint. So you may have heard of Joint, yeah.
The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee as a whole is a humanitarian relief organisation, and they pull together resources to assist Jewish communities around the world. And many years after its inception, they had a sub-project called JDC Entwine, and they are a youth leadership initiative to encourage young Jewish leaders to explore aspects of their Jewishness in relation to whatever the chosen topic is. So this one was the third, I believe, the third LGBTIQ plus JDC Entwine trip. We went to Argentina because back in 2001 they had a financial crisis, and JDC pulled in a lot of resources to help the Jewish population. Part of the trip was to see the fruits of the labour that was poured in 19 years before.
I might also, sorry, just quickly cut in that Argentina has the largest Jewish community in Latin America, so 100,000 Jews live in Argentina. And also, as far as the queer branch goes, it was the first Latin American country to legalise gay marriage, so in 2010, which, if you've been following along, is 7 years prior to this supposedly progressive nation.
True. So it was an interesting trip because we had three different sort of focuses. One was the local Argentinian population, just exploring the political situation there and how people are living and coping and struggling. Secondly, exploring the Jewish population and our own Jewish identities. And thirdly, exploring the queer identities both in Argentina and in ourselves. So it was an interesting mix. There were 16 people on the trip, 14 of us and two majachim, could we call them? Facilitators?
I'd rather not. They're my friends now, so
it's friends. True. And yeah, that's the main context behind it.
And we covered quite a range of countries, so even though I think past trips were nearly all American participants, this one we had...
and this one there were others, but we couldn't hear them. Over the Americans.
We love you Americans if you watch this video. So a lot of Americans, we had an Israeli from the Ukraine, we had someone from Hungary, someone from Germany, and then the three of us.
Israeli?
Yes, it's in Israel, yeah. And we went, in terms of the Jewish community exploration, we went into all the different sorts of places you might imagine going if you were to give someone that kind of trip here. And a lot of them were genuinely surprised that we were interested in seeing them at all. So going into Jewish schools, a Jewish nursing home, places like that, where they were sort of like, oh, like you're on holidays and you're choosing to come and see us, which was really cute because we were genuinely interested and they were just quite surprised by it. But
do you think Australians have cultural cringe at the moment? Yeah, it's big over there.
And it was pretty gorgeous making these connections with the people there. So I remember in the nursing home, we went into the activities room and were sitting with some of the residents, and a lot of them only spoke Spanish. So then we had to kind of get the people on our trip who were Spanish speakers to just translate. But then we started realizing connections we could make in languages beyond that, beyond English or Spanish. So I was using my really terrible Russian to speak to some of them. And then we also had Yiddish going on, which was also pretty terrible but cute. And it was just amazing, these connections we were making with these people. I personally have a family connection going back to Argentina. Some of our family left the former Soviet Union to go there. So I was having that whole kind of weird removed feeling of this could have been my life in some ways. And so making connections with some of those residents there, and one of them had the same name as our great-grandmother, who I'm named after, so we're talking about Odessa, and it was all very amazing to have this Jewish kinship with these people we'd just met in this, what otherwise felt like quite foreign country, but yeah, really beautiful to be invited in the way that we were. In the Jewish school as well, people were staring at us as we walked down the hallways like, who the hell is this group, and, you know, why are they here? And the 3 best English speakers were picked out to come and chat to us, all of whom, you know, were incredibly accomplished, amazing, erudite young people who, you know, were explaining to us aspects of their activism, pulling out like a scarf because currently abortion is a big issue there, and showing us this scarf that they're taking to protests, or, you know, telling us a bit about like what current issues are facing young Argentinian Jewish people. And yeah, it was just an amazing insight for us to get into their lives.
Yeah, and there are huge things happening in Argentina in regards to the feminist movement. It's very veganized now, and really active, and also inclusive language has become a huge initiative. So obviously in Spanish, speaking in gender-neutral forms is even more difficult. Like if you think they/them pronouns is difficult, try speaking in Hebrew or Spanish. So that's been really interesting, of ways that they're integrating kind of a queering of the language, and that there was this young activist, I think was 15 years old, was at an Argentinian protest for abortion, and her friends have really started to integrate this gender-neutral Spanish. So instead of using O or A, O being the masculine, A being the feminine, they use E. So it really changes the whole way the language works, and the kind of Puritans of grammar are very angry about it and think that it's disgusting. But as I'll remind you, thou used to be the singular of you, and the language actually evolves on a communal level, a community level, before it's integrated into dictionaries or whatever. But anyway, we can have that conversation later. So she's been speaking this way for a really long time, and she was interviewed by a reporter while she was there, and she just naturally was speaking in that form. And he started getting really angry. He was like, I speak Spanish, I don't know what it is that you're speaking. And it went viral, which was amazing because it was the first time that mainstream television had publicised any kind of gender-neutral Spanish. So there are big movements happening in Argentina in particular around their sex education and inclusive language. I remember even walking down the street of Buenos Aires, I found this plaque on the ground from October 2019, so it was pretty fresh, but it was about, it was dedicated to a man who was kidnapped during the dictatorship, and it was written by his children to acknowledge his life, and they signed it off hijes instead of hijos or hijas, which is children. So children is usually hijos, that being the masculine form, and instead of having an O or an A, had an X, which is another way that people are gender neutralizing it. But this is like a government plaque dedicated to, like, it's not relevant to gender and sexuality necessarily, but to see that kind of happening was really radical and cool. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, in terms of sex education, because one of the research projects I work on here at university is into sex education, so I see what all the countries are doing all the time, but I was still amazed to see their resources there, and these were official government-produced curriculum books, and it was stuff that if the Murdoch media here were to get onto that, it would be, you know, front page. Yeah, look what we're teaching the children and how we're brainwashing them, that sort of thing. But that was just their curriculum. There's, I mean, I'm sure there's reactions to it that I don't know about, but just seeing these books for all different age groups was really sort of fascinating. So it didn't feel tokenistic. As you turn the pages, you've got couples of all different, you know, different bodies, different gender identities, different races depicted. There are a lot more kind of, I guess, body positive and also a little bit more graphic in what they'll show children than we do. And it really was just eye-opening. And I think I had that, and I'm sure others did on the trip, of many moments of realizing, I guess, in Australia, like how far we have to go to catch up with them in many ways.
I think for myself, as our other panelists have explained, seeing the Argentinian queer communities and the Argentinian Jewish communities, that was very eye-opening. I think for myself, seeing the way that the 16 of us explored our own Jewish queer identity was probably the most impactful element. I remember, particularly over the Shabbos period, we were only there for a week. We were invited to a progressive synagogue where the rabbi welcomed us as a group of LGBTIQ Jews in front of everyone to a very positive response. We were invited to stay for a meal where we met the first Jewish gay couple married in Argentina. They only spoke Spanish, so I didn't understand what the heck they were talking about, but they seemed very lovely.
I got to chat to them.
Oh yeah, true.
They're fascinating. Yeah.
And then the following day was Saturday, Pride Parade. We marched under the, I know we have our thoughts about the claustrophobia of the event, but we all marched under the queer Jewish flag, the rainbow Jewish flag, which was very, it felt very, I don't know, like a warm fuzzy feeling. And then that night, the Saturday night, still in our Pride outfits, we gathered on the roof of our hotel, and we were arm in arm, and we sang the ancient wistful Havdalah tune together. You know, and just...
Not that ancient, that's Debbie Friedman.
Okay, it's not that ancient. But...
The tradition.
International.
Yes, exactly. And I can't explain it. There were people who had never done Havdalah once in their entire life. And that moment was Judaism, that moment was queerness, and it's something I'll never forget.
Yeah, and I think what was amazing is like, you know, when you're Jewish, traveling to the other side of the world, I don't know if you've had this moment, but I imagine maybe you have, when you travel to the other side of the world and you meet another Jew somewhere, and there's just this kind of instant sort of familial connection, like you can make some kind of connection about food or music or art or something, and it just feels a little bit like family. And I think I've had that a lot growing up, traveling and meeting other Jews, and I've also had that meeting other queer people in other places. Like, we talk about astrology, we talk about other like kind of points of connection. So to have that, of the amalgamation of both of those identities, to meet other queer Jews from around the world, and the amount that we had in common was so fascinating. And I think, Jarod, what you're talking about at this, like, there was this process of people reclaiming their queerness because they'd been very assimilated just into Jewish spaces, pretending that they're straight or pretending that their gay identity isn't defining. And there was vice versa, this reclamation of Judaism, of people who have purely existed or mostly existed in queer spaces, pretending that Judaism doesn't really mean that much and isn't important. So we were both kind of able to meet at this junction where we were essentially trading community values for the ones that we were lacking. And there was this particular moment when we were at that synagogue on the Friday night service where this kid, this bar mitzvah kid, got up and sang a song, and we all sang the song as well. And my friend turned to me and said, "Isn't it so cool that a kid in Argentina knows the same song as a kid in America and a kid in Australia? None of us had ever met or even been in the same country before, and we can sit here and sing the service." Like,
that's Judaism.
What a crazy thing. I did argue that, like, we probably all know Madonna's music as well, but there was something spiritual about both of those.
I did love in the Shabbat dinner afterwards when we were chatting to some of the people, and one of the men there, I got talking to him and he mentioned that he's married and had like a Jewish gay wedding, and I said, "Oh, where's your husband?" And he said, "Oh, he and I disagree about Judaism, so he goes to an Orthodox shul and I come to this progressive shul." And I was just like, I love that even here I'm finding this like this interesting dynamic going on in a relationship. Yeah, but the Shabbat really was beautiful.
I remember I was wearing my kippah because that's sort of where I'm at in my life. I'm not Orthodox, but there are times where I feel like I need to wear a kippah in this moment. And I was just, you know, going to all the queer places, all the Jewish places, all the Argentinian places, just with my kippah. And the response from some of the people in our trip who had pushed away from Judaism, seeing a Jewish queer person proudly with a kippah, I heard feedback that it really meant a lot, and that it helped them to reevaluate what Judaism meant in their lives. So that really was impactful for me.
Yeah, I feel like I need to get like a really tiny kippah to put on the top of my bum. I just can't, long hair and kippah, it just needs to be really tiny.
One other thing I found really interesting about the trip was I was talking to a friend who works for a Jewish organisation in Sydney, and she was saying to me, "Oh, I didn't realise you went on the JDC trip." And she was like, "Wow, you, Roz, going on a Jewish organised trip. I never would have picked you for that." Which, that friendship issue aside, I said to her, Well, that's because, and she's straight, and I said, you don't know what it meant for me to go into a Jewish space feeling safe, and to go in where on day one we didn't have to awkwardly talk about, you know, a partner, same sex, or anything about our gender or anything, just to have that level of comfort from the start in a Jewish space where all of us were on a different political spectrum, different religious observance, and I was explaining it to her, and she, you know, and we had this a few times on the trip as well, where speaking to people who don't tend to think too much about our existence, like we went to a seminary there and spoke to a couple of the rabbis, which was interesting in itself, but one of them, me and one of the people on the trip asked a question along the lines of how to bring people back in who have been alienated from Judaism or like are on the outside of it, and he was a little bit dismissive about that, sort of like, they'll come if they're going to come. You know, like he didn't really take ownership of that. And for me, I think that was a really interesting part for me, that it's not just us who need to go and find this space, but we need it to be made for us. And we need, I think, Jewish institutions to really start to look at some of the damage that's been done, because having been from, and I would say even earlier than when I came out, from really in the 90s to now, I've seen, and I'm sure elders in our community can speak to it much longer term than that, but I've seen so much harm done, and so I think, and sorry, this is getting into some of our other topics, but I think acknowledgement of that needs to happen, and then actual, within the institutions, there needs to be sort of formalised approach to really thinking about how to bring people back in, because it's beautiful that we have this audience today, but there are a lot of people who are absent who really could and would gain a lot from being here. And I think one thing we can really learn from that is, why are those people uncomfortable? If I hadn't done the trip to Argentina, I probably wouldn't show up in a panel like this. So I think thinking about like what sort of opportunities we need to make available that will make people come and find that family again and that sense of belonging is really important.
I can list probably between my two hands closeted Orthodox Jews who I've spoken with, and I wish they were here, and I hope they see this.
And that's also gay Jews, like to even start to conceptualize what trans identity looks like in spaces that separate men and women. Like, where am I supposed to sit? On the mechitza? You know, like, is that the non-binary spot on the top? Are there seats on the top of the mechitza and I can see everyone? That would be great. I mean, great view, you know, but like, what, like, and it's this thing that I was explaining earlier of like, when your mere existence is disruption, you can't help but disrupt. Like, you don't always want to be this kind of killjoy who is pulling people up on political correctness or whatever, but you don't have a choice. That is literally your skin on the line. So if I choose to sit in the men's section, that means ripping parts of myself off in order to sit in that spot. And so everyone else feels comfortable. But when you make everyone else feel comfortable your entire life, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for your sense of self, for how you see yourself, for your self-esteem, you know? And I think this trip, like, I had moments where, you know, I said to Roz, like, I think this is one of the first times I've been on holiday. Because, like, I'm an educator constantly, even when I don't want to be. Like, even choosing not to say something takes so much energy. You know, when someone says something and you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I forgot that the world wasn't made for people like me. Do I say something? No, I won't. Now I've lost 5 bars of energy just from that conversation that I've had with myself, you know? And so to be on this trip where I wasn't having to say, yeah, hi, trans people exist too, and they're saying, you know, men and women, I'm like, oh, hi, there are other genders maybe. I didn't have to do that. There were other people who were saying, oh, actually, they use they, them pronouns, or other people that said, oh, where can we go to the toilet? Or, you know, just to be considered, to actually be thought of by other people so you don't have to be the only person doing it all the time. And no one is expecting you to have that lens when you've never thought about it or been engaged before. But with the amount of information that there is now out there about making spaces accessible for disability, for people of different socioeconomic status, for races, like for various experiences of the world, there's no longer so many excuses for why we're not engaged with these things.
To follow on from, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, you can go.
Well, to follow on from going back to our Argentina trip, in terms of feeling safe and supported. So putting Jewishness aside for a second, I've found that for me as a gay man, it's so difficult to make genuine friends, within the gay community, because I can walk into a Jewish space, maybe I go there every week, maybe I've never been there in my entire life. I walk into that Jewish space, I'm part of the mishpacha, I'm part of the family. I walk into a gay space, I'm a piece of meat, or I'm immediately judged for my physicalness, or, you know, or it's so dark and the music is playing so loud that you can't make a connection anyway. But to actually be in a space with incredibly inspirational leaders, Jewish queer leaders, and to make long-lasting friendships with them, not, for me at least, not sexual offerings, but genuine long-lasting friendships. I found that to be really unique and something that I've tried to replicate since coming back to Melbourne. I know that there's so many queer people struggling, and now I make a conscious choice when I ever see a queer person to offer unconditional love. Not sexuality, unconditional love. Just to say, I see you, I really see you, and I embrace all of you, and I love you, and you're a good person. And I know there have been times in your life where you don't think you're a good person, but I think you are, and I see that within you. And just always remember that. And that's something I try to do now.
We're going to move to questions in a second. We've pretty much gone through roundabout all the questions that I wanted to. But I'm interested in going from this spot, this exact kind of spot that we've gotten to now. What are some of your visions for what queer Jewish spaces can look like in the future? What would you want them to be other than an online Facebook group?
I think one thing that I want to acknowledge about the trip is we are speaking almost in utopic terms about how brilliant it was and how we made these amazing connections and everything. It was also not work, but there were differences, and there was a lot of learning involved for a lot of people. I remember one of the people on the trip saying, "Oh, this is the first time I've met someone trans." And I was like, well, I don't know if that's true, like maybe you don't know it, but it's probably not the case. And like realizing I live in a little pocket of North Melbourne where I'm lucky to be in a pretty alternative community. A lot of the people I met are not part of very alternative communities at all. And I think I don't even know how to word this, getting some of that alternativeness that I'm talking about into the more mainstream community is pretty important to see some change. So by that I mean having representation, whether it's on boards at places, or in leadership roles, or so that younger people see themselves represented and see themselves going into those roles later on. I think is really important and is maybe part of the key to changing dynamics in getting people along, just so that there isn't such a sense of us and them, which I think there currently is. So in terms of my vision, it would be less of what's currently happening, which is certain groups seeing anything nuanced around gender and sexuality as identity politics, which is a separate rant that I could go on, and I won't. But getting more sense of understanding, more kind of dialogue and more of a sense of commonality, and then really making it so that rather than being at the fringes, we continue to still be fringe, but have some representation and inclusion in whatever wider communities that we want to be part of.
I'm coming from the other perspective where I've spoken with Orthodox gay Jews, bi Jews, trans Jews, who may not even have the language yet to identify that, but they are having those conversations internally. And they're coming from the perspective of, I am Orthodox, this is my base, how much queerness can I inject into my Judaism, rather than how much Judaism can I inject into my queerness, which I think is more where you were coming from, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for everyone it's going to be a different sort of ratio going on, depending on your background and what you've gone through. And I think For me, I was we self-appointed ourselves as the group elders, being like the later 30s of a group that had like a lot of younger 20s in it. So some of us have, I guess, seen some of the movements really come and change, and like currently I think in the queer community there is a younger, more alternative streak going on, which I think is a wonderful thing, much needed. So for me, I am coming to it from a different place to you, where I really felt, before you used the words, those of us who have pushed away Judaism, and I thought, actually for me it was more pushed out of Judaism. So it wasn't something I consciously decided to leave because it was very important to me. It was something that I felt I couldn't be in and be safe mentally or otherwise. So I think for someone like me, it's not about calculating, you know, how am I going to bring some Judaism into my queerness. It's more, do I feel safe to go to those spaces again? Which is a different dynamic.
I can say in terms of that, at least in 2020, at the worst, so I exist in many different Jewish spaces. At the worst, I feel tolerated, and at the best, I feel fully embraced and celebrated within the community as one of the people. Everybody I interact with in Judaism know I'm gay. It's not tokenized, it's not ignored, it's just sort of a fact of my existence, which is pretty cool. And if anything is spoken about, then someone else will jump in and be like, hey, like that's not appropriate. That said, no matter how much I'm accepted within the community, there is scripture, there is text that affects the way that our Jewish leaders speak about this topic to their congregations. That it does affect the fabric of Judaism in a sense. So it is a question that needs to be asked. And I don't know what the answer is, but I know from my Orthodox friends, the solution isn't rejecting the religion and embracing a cultural Jewish life. They want to be religious. They want to do their traditions that they grew up with. They want to have that Orthodox life. It can be tough. I don't know what the answer is, but I'd like to think that there is one.
I also think as a general rule of thumb, we can kind of calculate that where acceptance or like diversity, I hate all of those words, just so you know. The word inclusion, diversity, acceptance, I've heard them so many times they mean nothing. And now that corporations have their own diversity and inclusion branches, it's all kind of lost. But I think that we can kind of assume that where progressive politics are at in regards to gay rights, we're 20 years behind with trans rights. So while that may be your experience in Jewish spaces as a gay man, I think that experience for trans people, femme-presenting trans people, non-binary people, would be 20 years behind at where that gay experience may have been 20 years ago. And I think that that has a really huge impact as well on whether we feel safe to enter those spaces or not. But I do think that there are a lot of things that are already happening. So for example, I was one of the first, if not the first, trans people to be publicly out in any Jewish school in Melbourne. But now King David has a gender-neutral uniform policy, they have gender-neutral bathrooms, they've had multiple young people come out as trans since my graduation that I think have had very good experiences in the school because of that. I had a gay teenager come up to me once after a speech and say, I've never experienced any homophobia or discrimination at school. And at first I thought he was bragging, and I was like, good for you. And like, as a response to my story, but then he was like, I think that's because of you. And I was like, oh, thank you. I got so defensive. So I do think those things are really changing. I know that in Hubbo, for example, like I went on camp recently, and even in just the few years that I haven't been a madrich there anymore, like they've started integrating gender-neutral Hebrew language. So, for example, instead of calling people a madrich or a madricha, the singular is madrichol, with that suffix being from kol, so everything or all. There's been like the plural, and instead of madrichim or madrichot, is madrichimot. And that's like really standard language use now in Hubbo. which like blows my brain. They have like gender neutral bathrooms on camp. They've kind of started to do more gender neutral rooming, where like in the primary levels, I don't know how they're doing this now, but in junior, what they did was they gave kids and parents the option. So if they wanted a single gender room, they could select that, but if they didn't mind, so then they had. I remember when they did that, none of the boys chose single gender. They were just like, yes, girls, great. So what ended up happening was there were just like a couple of girls' rooms where girls only felt safe being with each other, and some mixed rooms. And I think it really benefits boys to be accountable for the ways that they speak and act to girls being present. I don't know if it actually does them any favours to be in only boys' spaces, but whatever, that's a different conversation. So I do think those things are happening. I think where I'd like to see us go, maybe not in Jewish spaces and not in queer spaces, but specifically queer Jewish spaces, is I'd like to get some funding and some actual money, because there are a lot of philanthropist Jewish organisations out there with plenty of money that haven't distributed any of that into queer specific initiatives. I would love to, I mean, I try to run something for the big Jewish holidays. So last year I did a queer Pesach with 30 people in my small share house in Thornbury, and recontextualised a lot of the Haggadah to kind of talk about modern queer issues and intersectional issues. There were a lot of non-Jews present as well, who I taught lots of songs to. It was really amazing. And my friend who's Jewish and queer and grew up in Jewish spaces, so it's not as if she didn't have access, said it was the most spiritual experience she's ever had. So those are the kind of initiatives that I really want to see more of, and I'd love to not be the only one organising them as well, but also to have funding for those sorts of things, because I think all of us do a lot of activism and a lot of social justice things on voluntary bases, and it's pretty hard to pay your rent even if you work full time these days. So what does that kind of look like? I'd like to now open the space for questions. We have still a fair bit of time. It's 3:20. This is set to end at 4. So if we want to have snacks and talk casually, we have the time and space to do that. But please ask us any specific questions you may have. The first question is always the hardest.
And we also, when we chatted about this, did say we want to know about you. We don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but anyone who is happy to share like what drew you to come today, or what things you're thinking about in relation to this topic, we'd love to hear from you. Which we don't always say it.
Yes.
So I don't know if I'm going to ask this question very well, because it's kind of just in my brain. But I'm American, and we went through a period in America where people were colorblind, and so we tried not to call out black people and white people and yellow people. And I just was wondering whether you still think we're at a point where we need to be very direct, and we need to say, you know, welcome different types of people in the congregation, or is it better to just, you know, kind of assume we're all open people and more act that way?
I think that's a really good question. It's a question that I get quite a lot in training that I deliver. So I also work for an organisation called Transgender Victoria, and we provide training in aged care facilities, specifically around elderly trans folk. And a question that I often get is people say, well, I don't see gender. Like, why do we have to talk about this? Doesn't that make it an issue? I think it's a really good question, because I think historically, when we say neutral, or when we imagine neutral, we imagine a man and we imagine a white person. That's what neutral has actually been. So like, if I was to say like, oh, did you see, like, I went to see my doctor, I wouldn't be surprised if someone said, oh yeah, what's his name? Or who is he? You know, like, it's just this kind of neutrality that we've created. And then when someone writes from the perspective of being a woman, she's a woman writer, or a woman philosopher, or a woman doctor, or, you know, it's like this added quantifier. Or if a person of color writes on race or something, it's like extra political. People make it out like it's not objective. It's not as objective as a white man, because that's objectivity for some reason. So I think when neutral is not neutral, when neutral is biased, when history is biased, when medicine is biased, when all of these kind of objective truths that we hold come from somewhere, like the history that we've learned about this country has always been from a white colonized perspective. How many of us have good working Indigenous knowledge about cultural practices of this land, or even the language equivalent on the land we stand on? Probably very little. When you learn that history is also written by the vicars and that you don't actually know all of the truths, you can't be colourblind and you can't be blind to gender, because the people that are blind to it are the most privileged. So when you say, I don't see colour, I don't see race, I don't see this, it's because what you're seeing is whiteness and what you're seeing is maleness. So you are seeing it, it's just been so normalised across history to see it that way. So I think it doesn't actually do anyone favours to not see it, except the people who have always benefited from it not being spoken about. But the people who live in black bodies, who live in trans bodies, we feel it every day. Our prison system sees it. The prison industrial complex sees Indigenous bodies far more frequently than they see any other bodies. Why is that? Colonisation, or, you know, we can unpack that a lot. But I think for as long as the systems in our society still see those things, we need to see them. And it doesn't bring it into existence by voicing it. You know, like I've spoken about gender and sexuality and race and all this stuff, and people say, that's very divisive. It's like, why did you invent these categories? Like, talking about them doesn't bring them into truth. It's just acknowledging that they exist. And, you know, it's that weird thing, right, where when you give people scholarships or you create quotas, other people perceive it as this leg up or this like extra thing. But when you've started off on different leveled ground, it's not an advantage to give someone enough to get there. That's what equity looks like, is actually addressing where people are in society. So it's that difference between equality and equity. If I was to give, if you were both hungry and I gave you both steaks, okay, maybe you'd be full, but if you had just eaten beforehand and you hadn't, you need more food than the other person. You know, like we just need different things. To give everyone the same thing doesn't put us on the same level. I hope that kind of...
Yeah, I was going to say on the congregational level that you were speaking about, yeah, I don't know to the point of saying like, Shabbat Shalom everyone, and to all our rainbow members, a special Shabbat Shalom. I don't think we need to go to that level, but then looking at spaces where there might be, you know, less rainbow, so to speak, more invisibility, how can we change that? And so I know for a number of years I kept annoying my wife by saying, I'm looking for a rabbi, like I'm really looking for my rabbi, and went on like a little journey of like calling a few shuls and like trying to make meetings with rabbis and that sort of thing. And I was pretty blatant and said, like, here's my background context. I went through a lot of rejection and homophobia, looking for like a very safe place. I didn't find it. I wasn't met with what I was looking for. And so, not saying that that's necessarily all on the rabbi or all on the leadership of the shul or that sort of thing, but I think when I was in the US and I went to CBST, which is an LGBT specific shul, it was the first place I sort of saw myself rejoining Judaism at all again. And I came back to Australia and just felt really sad and really lonely because I knew that I didn't find that here. And I went to Emmanuel in Sydney where I grew up, and they would have, you know, the Mardi Gras Shabbat and that sort of thing. And it was like, oh, okay, so there's pride and celebration when there's a queer festival on, but otherwise the rest of the year I don't know. Yeah, it's a complex one. I don't know exactly what the solution is, but I think for me, I never saw it like myself represented or my community represented across leadership roles. And I think seeing people who are LGBT up in those roles is really, really important. And so if they're not there currently, finding them. And I know obviously money is always an issue for that sort of thing, but you know, if there's money, a scholarship or bringing over someone to do something special with a part of the community and really showing those sort of, I speak of us as like a bit of a wandering around the desert still, like lost LGBT contingent of Jews, like really showing us that there's not just tokenistic welcome like sign at the door, but there's like really serious thought being put into it, and someone's actually gone looking for us in that desert, like not just waiting for us to kind of find the rainbow opening.
Yeah, that's helpful. And we would welcome you on the board. I'm on the board now.
Oh, thank you. I felt this was a job interview just now. Okay.
Yeah, and I also think like there's so many different ways to go about this, right? And like there's so many different ways to train organizations to do this. But I think you know, there's exclusion, there's inclusion, and then there's embracing. So, you know, like saying something like welcome to our Shabbat service, ladies and gentlemen. That's exclusion. I sit there and I think, I guess I'll just leave then, you know? And again, it's that thing of, I don't want to be in this political brain all the time, but like when that happens, everywhere I go, every day, it's this death by 1,000 paper cuts thing that we talk about. Like one time, ow. 2 times, ugh. You know, but 1,000 times, I'm ready to kill someone, I'm angry, you know? So, and then you could go from everyone. You could just say, hey, everyone. That's inclusion. That's great. I don't have to get cut. I'm not upset. That's fine. And then if you make a really political choice to say, ladies, gentlemen, people outside of the gender binary, anyone else, you know, like really didactically and explicitly say that, that's making a different choice, you know? And that's just an example. I'm not necessarily saying that's the best practice for wherever you are, but there are different kind of standards. And there's also a lot of organizations and businesses and places that lead with this ally thing that they claim to have, but they haven't done any of the work to earn it. It's a trophy, it's a medal. You don't get to self-impose this medal, buy it from some trophy shop and say, look what I earned. It's like, no, you bought that. Like, you bought it at a shop that produces it. You know, so what, like, I have to bestow that trophy onto you. And there are a lot of organizations that don't understand that. It's like when men introduce themselves as feminists. And you're like, what's your track record? Can I speak to your ex-wives? Like, do they think you're a feminist? You know, like, what about your mum? What does she think? You know, like, what do the women in your life think? So it's like, it's kind of like in maths where you've just written down the answer and not done any of the working out. I need to see the working out to know that you can actually process this answer that you've come to.
Sorry, we got very detailed there.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question about how you approach a certain theme, if it makes sense to you. The theme that I've been concerned about since I migrated here 50-some years ago has been the representation of minority groups in the mainstream. It's hard for the mainstream to really celebrate their diversity if they literally don't know that they know anyone who is very diverse. So joining Scouts, joining Guides, joining Kiwanis Club, joining a Rotary Club, joining a Lions Club, knowing that I'm going to be, in my case, a Jew, a migrant Jew, and looking at that club and noticing, oh, this is a club that also happens to have a Muslim and also happens to have someone who's a Singaporean, previously Malaysian, Chinese. There's a message just sent by being part of it. Now, that's the way I approach joining things. I'm wondering, how do you approach intentionally joining mainstream organizations in order to be there? Not to carry a flag, but just to be that introduction to the mainstream that they wouldn't have otherwise, because they wouldn't know they were meeting you.
It's a good question. I used to think about it a lot growing up because my mum had one non-Jewish friend. One non-Jewish friend. And she would always tell me, this is my non-Jewish friend. You know, like, she was so excited about it. She has one black friend, who she always tells me is her black friend, you know, like, and I just grew up just thinking, that is so sad. Like, it's amazing that we have our own community and that we're sufficient and we've got our hospitals and our doctors and our supermarkets and whatever, but at what point is it just segregation? You know, like, is it for safety or is it for comfort? And when do you push yourself out of your comfort zone? And I think these are important questions that as communities we need to be asking ourselves. What does it mean when you live on stolen land and have never met an Indigenous person? What does that mean? Why are there no Indigenous people around? What is that history? You know, and asking those questions, I think is really important. I think making choices to occupy spaces that might not always be comfortable for you is very different to spaces that won't be safe for you. I think that we conflate safety with comfort too often, but we can't live our lives in bubble wrap. and we actually do need to feel uncomfortable sometimes. I occupy a lot of different spaces, so I think what's important is having your bubble that you can return to. So, you know, like I definitely occupy spaces with people that are very different from me, that have very different perspectives, but I know that I've got my support networks around me to come back to. And I think that's really important, is that in order to be uncomfortable, you need to know where your comfort zone is. That's my favourite way of kind of answering that.
Yeah, when I appreciate the question too. When I was teaching at a public high school in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, there was quite a bit of anti-Semitism going on at the school, and it got quite bad at one point. And I'd been told by a few people that I was the first Jew that they'd met. And then when things escalated and there was like swastikas, it was around the time of Charlottesville in the US, there were a lot of swastikas and like really rampant anti-Semitism. At one point I ended up speaking to the Anti-Defamation League, just because things had escalated. And one of the things they said really interested me, which was we don't get many Jews going over to teach out there. And that really, it really struck me. And there was this sense that I got sometimes when I would kind of go back across the Yarra and go back to Caulfield and hang out with people there, and I would share some of the stories that were happening at school. And there was this real outrage, but also a sense of, why the hell are you doing this to yourself? You know, why are you inflicting this on yourself and going out with all these anti-Semitic goyim and going through this? Come and teach in one of our Jewish schools. And I didn't really like that idea, you know, to be the solution to, like, I'll go back and retreat into the safety of the type of school that I went to. And so I stayed there as long as I could. But I think it's a really important question. It's not one I have an answer to, but I think there is a personal cost to it at times, and that making yourself uncomfortable is definitely a part of it. And I think about the conversations I've had with some students, including some Muslim students who, you know, when we kind of went through a process of unpacking some stuff there, that they were hearing in their communities or their homes, there was this real sense of, oh, there's actually commonality between our people, or that, you know, there's, we like each other as people, even beyond our religions, and yeah, so I think that it's probably a bigger conversation for outside of this panel topic, but it's definitely important work to be done, and I think for me, leaving the kind of safety of the Jewish area was like the first step to doing some of that work. But definitely having that safe bubble to return to is important, because it's not something I had previously needed to do, so I hadn't really thought about it, and I think you need to really sort of protect yourself if you're going to go and do that.
I think the key for me is that I'm gay, so I can't speak to the struggles that Raz and Nevo have faced. But for myself, it can be exhausting sometimes to be the one gay person people know, to be the one token, you know, like the token diverse friend that someone has. And I put myself into a few interesting contexts where people have, you know, you tell people you're gay, suddenly they become investigative journalists and ask you, when did you know, what your parents did, blah, blah, blah. You know, and you have to go through the whole palm card spiel.
I like asking them those questions, though.
When did you know you were straight?
When did you know you were straight? When did you tell your family?
That's true. But the reason I keep doing it is because if I don't, if I'm not the one gay person they know, if I'm not the one person they've grilled, how do they know about gay people? Is it from the media? Is it from their fears? Is it from their phobias? So I need to put myself out there to protect all of us.
Yes.
Maybe we'll take one more question. Sure.
Yeah. First, something that I was thinking about, when you were talking about queering things, and like resisting regimes is the normal, and the like, I was thinking I think authentic Judaism is very queer. I reckon. Like we have this whole you know, struggle with God, Israel thing baked like very far deep in. That is like the ultimate, like resisting embedded power structures and things. And I think it's cool.
Yeah, I had a moment at Hubbo once where I explained to the kids what queer meant, and I was like, you know, it's like countercultural. It's like Hubbo. You're actually all really queer. And they were like, really?
And then a question for you and Roz. That you both grew up in youth movements, if I understood correctly. Like, how do you feel like that equipped you for activism later in life? And also, speaking as someone nearing the end of my own youth movement experience, how did you, I've found youth movements to be fairly unusually, you know, accepting Jewish queer places that maybe are more difficult to find elsewhere. And so, like, how did you cope with the transition out of that?
Wow, such a good question.
How long have you got?
Yeah,
I'll go next then.
Benay.
Oh,
oof. I think, again, it's that thing, and I don't get to talk about this outside of Jewish spaces because people don't get youth movements. Like, trying to explain the Jewish youth movement, and someone was like, oh, I was part of a Christian youth movement. I'm like, we are very different. That's nice, but no. So I think, firstly, it's that thing, right, of like, there is no extracting my youth movement. Like, there's no, I am a Hubbo kid through and through. Like, how much of my activism is influenced by Hubbo? Again, how many of my fingers are Hubbo fingers? Like, I can't extract that from who I am. It is so built into everything that I am. Like, I go back to Hubbo spaces and I'm like, man, no wonder I interrupt people a lot. Like, no wonder I'm so loud and boisterous, and no wonder I'm critically analysing things all the time. Like, is it a personality thing? Is it growing up in this environment? I don't know. I think transitioning out of that happened much easier than I expected it would, because time is like quicksand. Unless you actually hold structures, it'll just fall. So I was like, oh, I'm gonna have so much free time once I finish a youth movement, and I didn't. But I think like now that it's been 3 years since I was a leader, I've gone back on camps and volunteered in kitchen and done various things, and I think it's kind of been this like treasure chest of memories that I sort of put away and thought I'll access that when it's relevant. And with my non-Jewish friends, it's not relevant. And then I go back there and it just opens this chest of all of these feelings. And I feel so grateful to have that because it's always going to be such a big part of who I am, and taught me, like, I wouldn't have much of a relationship with Jewish practice, I think, if it wasn't for that. Whereas now I do every holiday pretty much, and Shabbat is an important time for me. And I don't know, there's so many values that I got from youth movements that, yeah, and just being able to track the progress of the youth movement, I think, like, activism is such a thankless process, and it's such a process that spans many lifetimes, so it's not the kind of thing that you're going to benefit the fruit of your labour. What it is a process where activists in the past have planted seeds, then sowed those seeds, and now I'm eating fruit all the time of work that I didn't do, and I'm planting seeds all the time of work that I'll never see the end of. But I think with youth movements, it's kind of a compression. It's like a bit more of a pressure cooker, and you can see the progress just a little bit faster, and I find that really gratifying.
Yeah, I won't speak to the being in it so much because I think you covered that brilliantly, but for me, there definitely was like a feeling of leaving it and then the sort of then what? And I think in my own case, what I really saw happen was people like left, they kept their friendships maybe, and then it wasn't really until like for some getting married and having children that they really came back together. So I think there really is space for like some maybe like formalized like adult Jewish activisty learning thing. I don't know. I think there's definitely a space for it there, because I think people do leave, and there can be, unless you have some like pre-existing structure to your practice or even just culturally your Jewish life, you can sort of just lose that. So I'm happy to chat to you more about that and my thoughts about it separately.
Just quickly, I'm not a very political person, not really an activist, but I've found that merely by existing as a Jewish gay man, I am by definition and making a political statement.
Yeah.
A straight couple can kiss in public. It's fine. If I kiss my boyfriend in public, heads will turn. People will either be artificially happy or artificially annoyed. Like either people are like, yes, like that's like yay, woohoo, or they'll be like, ooh, that's weird. Either way, you get some kind of response. And I just want to live my life. I don't want to talk about this stuff. I just want to live my private life and not have to discuss sexuality and sexual orientation and gender. But we're not quite there yet, so here I am.
Right, all right. Oh, yeah, go on. Sure. Yeah.
What I wanted to ask about and sort of like raise is something that you haven't actually mentioned, I think, and that is the whole structure of the family. Like for me, the biggest Jewish value is the family. But a bisexual woman who's lived a lesbian lifestyle for most of her life, the whole scenario about family was a huge thing, because even when my family accepted me, it was still like, what is your family going to be like? You know, and you know, even now, after years and years of my kids, you know, having my kids and all that, my family, my members of my family still say, well, you know, how do you feel about Charlie, who's not your biological son, who's actually your ex-partner now, biological son? And I sort of like, there's a difference somehow, and I say, but he's my son. He's my son. He's still my son, even though I didn't give birth to him. So I think very prevalent in our society. I wonder how you respond to that, because that's something like when you're young and you're coming out and you know, you're facing homophobia and you know all that sort of stuff where you're political and all that. Everything sort of really comes into its own, especially with, I think, for me, with my Jewishness, when I started to actually come into contact with what is my family and how do I live my family in a Jewish, you know, at the time I actually rejected Jewishness because I was saying to myself, my partner is not Jewish, I love Christmas, and they all said, this Passover thing, it's interesting one time, but to have to keep going back, sitting there for hours and hours and hours while people just read through this thing, you know, for hours, and they don't even know what they're doing half the time, you know, so, yeah, that's half the fun, you never know what we're doing. They just didn't get it, especially with the young kids.
Such a good question.
Yeah, like, I've always struggled with that, and I still struggle with it. Like, I think that's maybe, you know, where one of the problems, or one of the issues that we have to face as queer and gay and lesbian and bi, whatever we are, how does, especially as we get older.
Yeah, go for it.
For me, I think it starts when, I knew for sure I was gay when I was 12. And there's always signs when you're younger. I know a lot of people in the room could probably speak to, at least those who have an alternate sexual orientation, where you feel, I felt a warm fuzzy feeling looking at men. That would have happened when I was 4 or 5, you know, but I didn't have the language to describe. But at 12, you know for sure. And for me, there was a lot of shame, a lot of fear, a lot of anger, and you start to reject Judaism. Or you start to reject yourself, because I want to be the best Jew I can be, but there's something inherently contradictory there. And I know for a lot of religious people, because there's a challenge being within their religion, they may, if they can't have a piece, they may as well not have anything. It's like you have a fruit bowl, there's a peanut, you're allergic to peanuts, so you can't touch the entire fruit bowl. So they'll fling the pendulum the other way. They'll have their life. They'll try to find out who they are. Maybe down the track they found someone they want to settle down with, but they've spent this entire period rejecting their tradition, rejecting their faith, rejecting their family, rejecting a family structure. I know so many gay people who reject the idea